For a whole generation, this was it, the ultimate competition. But it wasn't fought on a battlefield. It was fought in the vast, silent arena of space. You see, the space race wasn't just about scientific discovery or, planting a flag. No, this was a high-stakes, full-contact ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Every single launch, every orbit, it was a flex of power, a test of whose system was better, and really, a fight for the hearts and minds of the entire world.
And this quote from President Kennedy, it just cuts right to the heart of the matter. He understood that space was the ultimate high ground, and not just militarily, but psychologically. Think about it. For billions of people watching back on Earth, every success in space shouted technological superiority, economic might, and, most importantly, that your way of life was the best. This wasn't just a friendly race. It was the Cold War's most visible, most awe-inspiring frontline.
All right, so here's how we're going to break down this incredible story. We'll start with how space became a new battlefield. Then we'll get into the shock of Sputnik. After that, America's big move. We choose to go. We'll also look at the tragedy and triumph involved, cover the moment the Eagle landed, and finally, see how these rivals eventually became partners. Okay, first up, a new battlefield. Now, you might think the space race kicked off with some beeping satellites, right? Well, the real story actually starts in the ashes of World War II. As soon as the war was over, a totally different race began. It was a frantic scramble by both the US and the Soviets to get their hands on Nazi Germany's super-advanced V-2 rocket technology, and, just as importantly, the brilliant and, let's be honest, morally complicated scientists who designed them.
So this timeline really shows you how all the pieces started falling into place. First, the US grabs a bunch of German rocket scientists with Operation Paperclip. Then, boom, the Soviet Union tests its first nuke in '49, which just turns the heat way up. But here's the absolute game changer, the development of ICBMs, Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. And this is the key thing to get. The exact same rocket tech you need to lob a nuclear warhead across the planet, that's the exact same tech you need to push a satellite into orbit. The arms race and the space race weren't just related, they were basically two sides of the very same coin.
All right, Chapter 2, the Sputnik Shock. Picture this. It's October 4th, 1957. The world literally changes overnight. Not with a bang, but with a simple, steady beep, beep, beep come in from orbit. That little sound was coming from Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. And it was Soviet.
And what's so fascinating is the story behind Sputnik. So the Soviets' first plan was this huge, complicated science satellite they called Object D. But then they heard whispers that the US was getting close to launching its own satellite. So their chief designer, a guy named Sergei Korolev, made this absolutely brilliant call. He said, scrap it, let's build something simple, fast. They rushed out this tiny, polished sphere with basically just a radio transmitter inside. The goal wasn't science. The goal was to be first. It was a pure propaganda play, and man, did it work.
This quote just nails the feeling in America at the time. It wasn't just a little bit of concern. We're talking about a full-blown crisis of confidence. People called it the Sputnik crisis, and it led to actual panic. All of a sudden, the sky didn't feel so safe anymore. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If the Soviets can fly a satellite over your house, they can definitely fly a bomb over it. That little beeping sound from space, for a lot of people, it was a horrifying wake-up call.
So America's response? It was pretty frantic, and honestly, a bit of a disaster at first. Their first attempt, the Vanguard rocket, blew up right on the launch pad on live TV for everyone to see. People started calling it Flopnik and Kaputnik, total humiliation. But then, the government turned to Wernher von Braun and his team, and just a few months later, they got it done. They launched Explorer 1. And here's the cool part. Not only did it work, but its little instruments made the very first major scientific discovery of the space age, the Van Allen radiation belts. This whole crisis basically forced the government to get serious, and that's when they created one single agency to run the show, NASA.
Okay, on to Chapter 3. We choose to go. So just as America was finally getting its act together, the Soviets landed another massive punch. They weren't just launching metal spheres anymore. Nope. They were putting actual human beings into orbit. That's right. On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, but it made him an instant global hero, a living symbol of Soviet power. And for the brand new Kennedy administration, which was already dealing with the fallout from the Bay of Pigs disaster, this was just a profound humiliation. It was a huge problem.
Kennedy absolutely needed a win, and fast. He basically went to his advisors and said, "Find me a space goal that's so big, so ambitious, and so far off that we actually have a shot at getting there first." And the answer they came back with was the moon. So with this one speech, Kennedy didn't just raise the stakes, he basically picked up the finish line and moved it 240,000 miles away, committing the entire country to the monumental task that became the Apollo program.
So how did they even plan to pull this off? Well, this chart shows it perfectly. Look, the Soviets were dominating all the early firsts. First man in space, first woman, first spacewalk. They were winning. But America had a secret weapon, an often overlooked program called Gemini. Across 10 missions, Gemini astronauts practiced and perfected all the tricky stuff you need to do to get to the moon, like rendezvous, finding another ship in orbit and docking with it. Gemini was the critical training ground. It's where the U.S. didn't just catch up, it's where they pulled ahead.
And that brings us to Chapter 4, Tragedy and Triumph. Because moving this fast, pushing the technology this hard, it came at a terrible price. Both sides were pushing the absolute limits of what was possible, and the risks were just immense. This wasn't a game. This was life and death.
1967 was just a devastating year. In January, a fire broke out inside the Apollo 1 capsule during a simple launch rehearsal on the ground, killing all 3 astronauts inside. Then, just 3 months later, the Soviets had their own tragedy. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died when his Soyuz 1 capsule's parachute failed as he was coming back to Earth. These 2 disasters, back-to-back, were this brutal gut punch for everyone. It was a wake-up call that forced both countries to stop everything and fix some major fatal flaws in their spacecraft.
But out of that tragedy, an incredible triumph emerged. In what was a seriously bold, super risky move, NASA decided to send the Apollo 8 crew all the way to the moon in December of '68. They didn't even have the lunar lander ready yet. On Christmas Eve, as they orbited the moon, they turned their camera back and broadcast one of the most powerful images in all of human history, Earthrise, our tiny, fragile blue planet hanging in the blackness. For a world that was pretty torn apart at the time, it was this incredible moment of unity.
And now, the climax. Chapter 5. The Eagle has landed. The finish line was right there. The Apollo program was firing on all cylinders. But as the U.S. was getting ready for the final push, their rivals' own moon dreams were, well, they were literally going up in smoke.
So here's something most people didn't know at the time. The Soviets had their own gigantic moon rocket, called the N-1, and it was an absolute, total disaster. Every single one of its 4 test launches ended in a catastrophic explosion. One of the blasts was so huge it completely vaporized the launch pad. Without a rocket that could actually get off the ground, the Soviet dream of landing a cosmonaut on the moon, it was over.
July 20, 1969. This was the date. After all the years of work, all the sacrifice, all the billions of dollars, this was it. The entire world was holding its breath as the Apollo 11 lunar module, the Eagle, made its final descent toward the Sea of Tranquility. For a few nail-biting moments, computer alarms were screaming in the cockpit, and the whole mission was hanging by a thread. And then, contact. Humanity had touched down on another world.
And with those famous words, Neil Armstrong took his first step onto the surface of the moon. Over 700 million people, that's about a fifth of the entire planet's population at the time, were watching it happen live. It was the fulfillment of Kennedy's challenge from all those years ago. It was the undeniable peak of the space race. The United States had won.
So what happens after the race is won? That brings us to our final chapter. Rivals become partners. You see, as the world moved into the 1970s, the political climate started to change. This period called détente began, basically an easing of Cold War tensions. And as things on Earth started to thaw out, so did the rivalry in space. And in July of 1975, something happened that would have been completely unthinkable just a few years before. An American Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz capsule met up and docked in orbit. The 2 commanders reached across the hatch and shook hands. That handshake, high above the planet they both called home, is pretty much seen as the symbolic end of the space race. And that handshake wasn't just for the cameras. It really did lay the groundwork for decades of partnership. It led directly to things like the Shuttle Mir program in the 90s, where U.S. space shuttles visited the Russian space station. And that, in turn, led to the International Space Station, a lab in orbit built and run by a coalition of nations where American and Russian crewmates have lived and worked together for over 2 decades now.
Which really leaves you with a fascinating question, doesn't it? This whole thing started as a bitter proxy war, a zero-sum game where one side had to win and the other had to lose. But it ended with a handshake. It evolved into one of the greatest scientific collaborations in human history. So it makes you wonder, in a race with only two competitors, who really wins when they decide to cross the finish line together?
Of course, the space race is just one part of the huge, complicated story of the Cold War. If you want to see how these tensions played out in other arenas, definitely check out the other explainers we have in our Cold War playlist. And hey, if you like this breakdown, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thanks so much for watching.